The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from The Elephant in the Dark by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. During all this time, there have been many instances of cooperation and understanding between Muslims and Christians, and Jesus himself has never ceased to hold the highest possible place in the mind of Islam. But the background of thinking in Christendom about Islam, with the possible exception of the Christian communities in Muslim lands, has hardly ever, until recently, considered the possibility that Muslims might take any part in the rethinking of religious matters in any sense which might be of interest to, let alone of any value to, Christians. The dramatic change which has taken place in this attitude in recent years is reflected in the increasing number of writings by men of importance in the West who have begun to consider this possibility, and also, equally important, the far greater currency of these ideas. To write is not enough, the words must be read. To read is not enough, it must be understood. Dr. Geoffrey Parender, Professor of the Comparative Study of Religions at London University, a Protestant minister and Secretary of the British branch of the International Association for the History of Religions, a major contemporary in the academic study of the comparison of religions, says, "In modern times, a great deal of rethinking of traditional doctrines and their expression is being done, so that dialogue between the religions is much easier than for centuries past. Some doctrines, at least, have been expressed in language that is outdated and often incomprehensible. Ideas that Christ came from up there, intervened in the world and played a superhuman role, may need changing to fit conceptions of God as ever present in the world, and of Jesus as fully human and historical. Islam may share with Christianity in this process of rethinking." Jesus in the Quran, London, Faber and Faber, 1965. Individual friendships between Christians and Muslims have been a part of our common history and cultural life for almost 14 centuries. The effects of these, most of them probably undocumented, continue and must have the most important role in dialogue and mutual understanding. The following instance, found in a general circulation book of reminiscences with an enormous world sale, is quoted because it is typical, rather than as an occasion for special remark. The Italian Duke, Alberto Denti di Piragno, who lived for many years as a doctor in Islamic countries of the Arabs and Africa, writes of the deep affection between the apostolic vicar in Libya and the mayor of Tripoli. "The bishop knew every detail of the life of Mu'addin ben Arabi, a famous Arab mystic of about the year 1200, of whom I had never heard." He continues, "The friendship between the bishop and the pasha was one of the most extraordinary I have ever seen. I have never met two men who were, on the surface, more directly opposed in temperament, and rarely have I come across a deeper and closer friendship. The Italian was of modest origin, the Arab the head of a princely family which had once ruled the country. The bishop held to the simple and pure faith of St. Francis of Assisi. The prince was a fervent and practicing Mohammedan. The humble Christian had an encyclopedic erudition. The Muslim nobleman was illiterate. I had often asked the bishop about his friendship with the pasha, endeavouring in my curiosity to discover on what it was based. He was always evasive in his reply. Sometimes he did not reply at all, and confined himself to raising his shoulders and blowing into his beard. The more I came to know the Arab nobleman, however, the more I discovered what they had in common. For example, their indifference to illness, their complete disregard of material considerations, their deep understanding of human suffering and misery, and their charity, which was unsmirched by egotism and knew no limits. Both of them submitted to a higher will with the blind faith of children. At a certain point I realized that, just as the various elements in a mosaic form a single design when placed together, so the mental attitudes of the two friends were part of a single spiritual conception, which I was at last able to recognize. The Duke continues that he at last told the bishop that he had decided that their friendship was a friendship between Franciscans, and the Franciscan replied, "I have learnt much from this man." Piranio continues, "The younger of the two friends died first. Suddenly the uncertain equilibrium of his metabolism was shaken, and the bishop, who had remained a simple friar, collapsed. I was far away from Tripoli when it happened, and only later did I learn how the apostolic vicar had died serenely, surrounded by confreres and nuns, gripping the hand of his old friend the Pasha, who in his sorrow seemed turned to stone, while in the cathedral, in the mosque, and in the synagogue men of different creeds prayed that God would postpone the appointed hour." Alberto Denti di Piranio, A Cure for Serpents, London, Consul, 1965. A Book Society recommendation originally published in Britain in 1955 by André Deutsch. Now this account represents the relationship of two men of God, meeting, living, and working in what we might call the intermediate period, the post-Crusades era, but yet the time of colonialist rule of a Muslim country, under circumstances which, one might be forgiven for thinking, mutual understanding between members of the ruled and allies of the ruling power would be extremely difficult. An outside observer might well conclude that after the colonialist period, the beliefs of the occupying power would be discredited, to say the least. And yet today, in independent Libya, as anywhere else in the world of Islam, you may speak a single word against Jesus only at your peril. The teachings of Islam, that Jesus came from God and invited people to surrender to God, are part of the knowledge of every Muslim. Note the following passages from the Quran. God giveth thee tidings of a word from him, whose name is the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary. 3:40-45. And in chapter 2, verse 136, Say, we believe in God, and that which hath been sent down to Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and the tribes, and that which hath been given to Moses and to Jesus, and that which was given to the prophets from their Lord. No difference do we make between any of them, and to God we are resigned. The mutual influence of the practice of submission to God, the influence of the practice itself, it might almost be said, upon man, has such extensive expressions and has left its mark so deeply that instances are very widespread. We can even find a typical example, and there may be more than one, in the extremely scanty documentation of the history of Muslim rule in Switzerland, nearly 600 years before the foundation of this venerable university. It concerns the devout Saint Mayol, the abbot of the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy, and his encounter with the Muslims here. Such was the respect in which qualities compelled people to hold him, that his name was once seriously mentioned for the high and exalted office of the papacy. Shawani's translation of Raynaud's Invasions, 1836. Ashraf, Lahore, Pakistan, 2nd edition, 1964. The saint had been on a pilgrimage to Rome, and on his way back was captured by the Muslims, who dominated the countryside. He was held prisoner in a cave, and the Muslims, touched by the unalterable calm of the prisoner, sought to make his lot a little better. Thus, when he required some food, one of them, after washing his hands, prepared a little paste on his shield, cooked it, and handed it over to him with great respect and consideration. One of his captors reminded another that he should respect the Bible which the abbot carried with him, as the book of Jesus. The abbot was ransomed by the monks of Cluny and set free by his Saracen captors, and this anecdote is still remembered, though it happened in the year 972 of the Christian reckoning. It is retold in a book reissued by a Muslim publisher and read in Islamic countries, whose latest edition is dated 1964. Thus does the basis of dedication resound down the centuries without diminution, for 1,000 years. The submission to the will of God, or surrender to God, has for Muslims a social and administrative equivalence. Since the Quran enjoins certain forms of behavior, of conduct of state, and the cultivation of moral virtues, these are, for the Muslim, requirements of God, and hence their discharge constitutes surrender to God in the fullest sense. Christian virtues, too, have been expressed in the same way and for similar reasons. We are often reminded that much Western law is based on this concept. Reinhardt's French work about Islamic communities in Europe, including Switzerland, where Muslim suzerainty from its centre in Fraxinay in Provence lasted for many decades, notes the respect which was felt for the achievements and character of the Saracens who ruled so much of Europe. While many clerics regarded these Muslims as pagans and idolaters, the troubadours and poets speak of them with astonishing respect and approval. Reinhardt says that if the Muslim rulers, some of whom were certainly in occupation at Geneva, were to come back to life, they would be utterly shocked to find the great changes which have occurred in the respective positions of the Muslims and Christians in Europe. But when the first impressions have been obliterated, they would be agreeably surprised at the important place given to their exploits by the old romance writers of France, and as their spirit world would be accustomed to great and adventurous deeds, it would surely pay homage to the sentiment of courtesy which ennobled the barbaric manners of ancient Europeans, and which now seems, alas, to be disappearing day after day. Invasions des Sarrasins en France et de France en Savoie, en Piémont et en Suisse, translated by Haroun Khan Shawani, Lahore, Ashraf, 1964 edition. Feelings of respect and interest in an allied system have not been one-sided. In the popular, narrative, and lighter areas of oral admonition, it has been customary for Muslims and Christians to take each other's virtues as texts for teaching. There is a half-humorous tale told among Muslims of the Muslim who asked a Christian why he did not embrace Islam. The Christian said, "There are two Islams, the one which you practice, and the Islam of the Quran. If I were to try to live up to the Quran, it would be too difficult for me, for it requires man to make tremendous efforts to improve himself, and I could not receive any absolution from any man as a Muslim." "But," said the Muslim, "what about the Islam that you call the other kind of Islam, that which I practice?" "If I were to behave like you do," said the Christian, "with your low standards of honesty, I would not be improved. I would be reduced in merit." The same role of measuring oneself against the other man is found in abundant use among Christians. Thus, from the early days of confrontation between the two religions, Christians are frequently on record as contrasting, in approach to their flocks, the achievements, industry, piety, and so on of the Muslims, as against their own current conduct. They generally even attribute the worldly success of the Muslims of their times to their having practiced, that is, submitted themselves to, the ordinances of God which concern the cultivation of such direct and derivative commands as truthfulness, honesty, and dedication to ideals. This podcast is copyright 2016, the Idries Shah Foundation.